Millionaire regrets leaving his pregnant wife Mistress was not who she claimed to be. Picture a grand marble foyer in an upscale Manhattan penthouse. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers reflects on polished floors, and the air hums with the promise of opulence. Now imagine a well-dressed millionaire standing alone, his trembling hands clutching a single photo, a snapshot of a woman he used to adore. But the photograph is slipping from his grip because everything he thought he knew has just come crashing down. This is the story of Alexander Coleman, once poised on top of the world, now on his knees. A luxurious life, a devout wife, and a cunning mistress. Prepare yourself for a tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and shocking secrets that threaten to destroy everything he's ever built. Alexander Coleman had always been the ambitious type. Growing up in a middle-class family in suburban Chicago, he learned early on that success came to those who never gave up. His parents, both public school teachers, instilled in him the value of hard work and unflinching perseverance. By the time Alexander was 30, he had already doubled the size of his investment firm, Coleman Holdings, catapulting himself to local stardom in the financial scene. He had the sleek black Lexus, the tailor-made suits from Savile Row, and a corner office with a glass wall overlooking the city's bustling hub. Media outlets like Forbes had taken note, featuring him in an article titled "Young Investors Reshaping the Market." Everything had fallen in place like a perfectly arranged puzzle. But what truly defined Alexander was his relationship with his wife, Julia Coleman. She was the girl who had supported him since college, back when their idea of luxury was splurging on takeout pizza during finals week. They got married right out of grad school, Julia with a master's in education, Alexander with a freshly minted MBA. Their wedding reception was modest but filled with genuine laughter among close friends and family. Their hearts were warm, and their dreams were big. Julia was a quiet, nurturing soul, content with the simpler aspects of life. She believed in Alexander's potential more than he believed in himself. When Alexander's first attempt at launching a hedge fund collapsed under the weight of his inexperience, it was Julia who held him at night, reminding him that failure was only a stepping stone. And indeed, her faith was not misplaced. Coleman Holdings blossomed a few years later, turning the couple's modest condominium into a penthouse in Manhattan and placing them among the city's young elite. To celebrate yet another milestone, a feature in the New York Times highlighting Alexander's philanthropic work, the couple decided on a trip to the Ritz-Carlton. The plan was to enjoy a weekend getaway, savor gourmet meals, and maybe even treat themselves to a spa day. Julia, 3 months pregnant, glowed with the gentle radiance of impending motherhood. Alexander looked at her and felt a rush of pride, gratitude, and a flicker of excitement about the future. Together, they were unstoppable. At least, that was what he believed at the time. Unfortunately, the comfort of success sometimes carries an unseen danger: complacency. And complacency can render one vulnerable to temptation. In an industry teeming with lavish galas and exclusive events, it's all too easy to cross paths with intriguing strangers. And that was precisely the start of Alexander's downfall. It was at a black-tie charity ball for a prestigious New York City arts foundation. Julia had chosen to stay home, feeling too exhausted to socialize. Alexander had gone alone, determined to make connections. The event was brimming with wealthy patrons in designer gowns and tuxedos, classical music wafting through the air. Beneath the shimmering chandeliers, the city's upper crust milled about, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. That was where Alexander met Adriana Bishop, a statuesque brunette with an easy laugh and a mesmerizing smile. She wore a deep green satin gown that seemed to flow like liquid emerald around her slender form. She claimed to be a philanthropist who had studied art history at Harvard. The conversation between them started out innocently enough. She showed interest in Alexander's charitable activities, praising his desire to give back to local art programs. For a man used to the standard brand of schmoozing at high-profile events, Adriana's attention felt refreshingly genuine. Adriana was witty, intelligent, and seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of contemporary art, from Basquiat to Banksy. She spoke with such effortless charm that Alexander found himself leaning in, savoring every word. He convinced himself that it was merely professional rapport, but as the night went on, he felt an undercurrent of electricity whenever their eyes locked. The more they talked, the more he realized he was crossing an emotional boundary he had never dared approach before. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander discovered himself texting Adriana. At first, it was about continuing a conversation they had at the gala, something about an upcoming art exhibit. Then the messages grew more personal. He told her stories about his upbringing. She confided that her parents had passed away when she was in college, leaving her largely alone in the world. Alexander offered sympathy, and she thanked him, admitting she rarely opened up so quickly. It was a slippery slope. The adrenaline of a secret relationship lured Alexander into dangerous territory. What began as a friendly exchange evolved into clandestine dinners, then long drives along the Hudson at dusk, and eventually nights spent in a swanky hotel suite that Adriana always managed to book last minute. Alexander, who had never cheated on Julia or anyone else in his entire life, felt a mixture of guilt and thrill thrumming through his veins. He rationalized it in all sorts of ways. Julia was busy with her pregnancy, often tired or preoccupied with baby preparations. She didn't quite understand the intensity of his world, the demands of high finance and philanthropic obligations. Adriana, on the other hand, seemed to mirror his passions, his willingness to take risks, and his hunger for the finer experiences in life. His moral compass grew distorted, overshadowed by the excitement of living on the edge. But secret lives are hardly sustainable. Rumors swirled in Manhattan's social circles, subtle enough that Julia remained unaware, but direct enough that Alexander's closest associates began to question him. Even his personal assistant, Danielle, who had been with him for 5 years, couldn't hide her concerned frown whenever Adriana's name popped up. Still, Alexander pressed on, convinced that he had it all under control. Little did he know, the stage was set for a tragedy of his own making. Julia sensed something was off long before she confirmed it. She noticed Alexander working later nights, preferring to unwind at after parties rather than come home to her. Their once shared morning coffee ritual turned into a solitary affair for Julia. He arrived home at ungodly hours, reeking of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. Although she was 5 months pregnant and had enough on her mind doctor's appointments, nursery plans, prenatal vitamins, her instincts raised alarms. One evening, Julia found a small, glittering earring wedged in the back seat of Alexander's car. She recognized it from a brand she could never afford: Van Cleef and Arpels. Confronting him, she endured a string of flimsy excuses. It must belong to a colleague. She needed a ride. The utter hollowness of his lies cut through her like a blade. She didn't press further then, perhaps out of fear that once the truth was vocalized, it could never be taken back. Still, the seed of distrust was planted, and it grew more poisonous by the day. At Coleman Holdings, Alexander faced mounting pressure from a new, aggressive competitor, Hawthorne Capital. They were poaching his top clients, undercutting his fees, and rumor had it they had inside information about his investment strategies. Worse still, employees in Alexander's firm whispered that maybe he was too distracted by personal entanglements to notice. If he had been paying attention, he might have recognized the full scope of the threat that Hawthorne Capital posed. But Alexander was too lost in Adriana's orbit to appreciate the looming crisis. As for Adriana, her demands escalated. She expected extravagant vacations and lavish gifts. She wanted Alexander by her side at exclusive soirees. Her soft spot for the arts turned out to require expensive paintings, jewelry, and more. At times, a flicker of unease tickled the back of Alexander's mind. Wasn't this all a bit too fast? Too hungry? Too one-sided? But she had an explanation for everything: her lonely childhood, her heartbreak over losing her parents. He told himself that his generosity was an act of love and compassion, never mind that it depleted not only his bank account, but also the time and emotional energy he should have dedicated to his family. In the midst of this turmoil, Julia's pregnancy advanced. Her once gentle, calm disposition grew fraught with an undercurrent of worry and heartbreak. She tried, valiantly, to salvage their relationship. She arranged a romantic dinner at home, cooking all of Alexander's favorite dishes: grilled salmon with lemon butter, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, a decadent chocolate soufflé. He was hours late, stumbling in with a vague apology. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed that night. His phone buzzed incessantly with texts from Adriana, compounding Julia's heartbreak. That very weekend, Julia discovered a hotel receipt in Alexander's suit pocket. It was from the Ritz-Carlton, the suite for 2 nights. Anger, sorrow, and betrayal washed over her. The next morning, she found herself on the phone with her mother, sobbing uncontrollably. For the first time in her life, she truly believed her marriage might be beyond repair. She was 6 months pregnant, and the father of her child was slipping away into the arms of another woman. Meanwhile, Alexander assured himself that once the baby arrived, he'd figure out a way to reconcile everything. He tried to soothe his guilt by making grand gestures toward Julia: an expensive handbag from Chanel, a new car, but none of it addressed her emotional wounds. They were empty tokens that failed to mend what he had already shattered. And so the clock continued ticking, each day drawing him deeper into a labyrinth of lies. Setting the stage for the inevitable fall, Julia's worst suspicions were confirmed on a balmy summer night. She had mustered the courage to track Alexander's credit card statements. This was completely uncharacteristic of her. She respected his privacy, but desperation had forced her hand. The record was a litany of high-end restaurants and boutique purchases, often during times he claimed to be working late. Then came the ultimate blow. A text message flashed on Alexander's phone while he was showering. It read, "I miss you. Can't wait until our trip to Milan next month." It was signed A. Julia felt her heart slam against her ribcage. Her fingers trembled. She scrolled through the conversation thread. Explicit messages, intimate photos, travel plans for romantic getaways. Her world collapsed in those few seconds, leaving her numb, angry, and utterly devastated. When Alexander emerged from the shower, Julia was pale, clutching his phone. He froze, every drop of blood draining from his face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "Why?" The sorrow in her eyes was beyond heartbreak. It was the look of someone who just realized her entire life was built on a lie. The ensuing argument was fiery and tearful. Alexander offered hollow apologies, lame justifications. He insisted it was just a fling, that he had been stressed at work, that it was never meant to go this far. Julia demanded he end the affair immediately. For a fleeting moment, he promised he would. But whether due to Adriana's hold on him or his own weakness, he couldn't follow through. Their household became a war zone of silent meals and slammed doors. Julia threatened to leave multiple times. She considered going to her parents' house for the remainder of the pregnancy, but part of her still held on to the hope that Alexander would come to his senses. She loved him, and she wanted her child to have a father. The lines between self-preservation and devotion blurred dangerously. Eventually, Alexander's double life met its tipping point. 8 months into Julia's pregnancy, he received an ultimatum from Adriana. She demanded he leave Julia for good. Her reasoning was laced with cunning. "If you truly love me," she said, "you'll choose me over her." She told him it was time to live his truth, to free himself from the shackles of a marriage that was clearly stifling him. And perhaps to Alexander's own astonishment, he found himself agreeing. On the day he left their penthouse, Julia was in the nursery, folding tiny baby clothes. She didn't even look up as he walked in with a suitcase. There was no screaming or begging, only a stony, desolate silence. She had already braced herself for the blow she knew was coming. As Alexander trudged out, a wave of nausea, both physical and emotional, swept through him. But he steeled himself. He had chosen Adriana. Julia was left alone, 8 months pregnant and utterly shattered. The emptiness in their once warm home loomed large, like a haunting spectre of broken promises. She spent hours crying into the baby's crib, wondering how the man she had loved for so many years could turn into a stranger overnight. Alexander moved in with Adriana, who owned, or so she claimed, a lavish loft overlooking Central Park. The place was tastefully decorated with modern art and expensive furniture, but Alexander couldn't shake the impression that the entire space felt staged, as though it belonged to someone else. He told himself he was just overwhelmed by the massive life change. He tried to quell his guilt with the excitement of a new beginning. Days turned into weeks. He visited Julia sporadically, mostly to drop off checks or to sign paperwork related to the baby's pending birth. He told himself he was doing the right thing by supporting her financially. After all, wasn't that the honorable thing to do? Deep down, though, he knew he was failing miserably as a partner, as a soon-to-be father, and as a decent human being. But Adriana kept him distracted with parties, travel, and constant reassurances that they were meant for each other. Alexander's new life with Adriana initially felt like an opulent dream. They traveled to Milan for a week-long shopping spree, stayed in 5-star hotels, and attended exclusive events. Adriana introduced him to her circle of friends, many of whom were wealthy socialites, art collectors, and celebrity chefs. Alexander was dazzled, living a fantasy he'd never even dared to imagine. However, strange inconsistencies soon emerged. He noticed that Adriana never seemed to have any close friends from her supposed Harvard days. Whenever he asked for more personal details, like yearbooks or old photos, she brushed off the questions with vague answers or playful teasing. Her financial background was equally murky. Sometimes she'd claim an inheritance, other times she'd mention a trust fund set up by distant relatives. Alexander also found it peculiar that the loft was rarely used for private gatherings. Adriana preferred meeting her so-called friends at upscale lounges or restaurants. And though she flaunted expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and top-of-the-line electronics, Alexander never actually saw any official paperwork tying her to that lavish loft. It was almost as though she was just occupying the space temporarily. One evening, while Adriana was out with clients, a term that made Alexander uneasy. Given he had no clue what services she provided, he rummaged through a desk drawer, searching for a notepad. There he stumbled upon a set of documents that didn't match Adriana's story at all: rental agreements under different names, mysterious bank statements from offshore accounts, and even multiple passports with different identities. He felt his stomach knot. Could Adriana be involved in something illegal? Before he could fully process what he'd found, Adriana returned. Panicking, Alexander quickly shoved everything back into the drawer, hoping she wouldn't suspect his snooping. She entered the loft in a whirlwind of laughter and champagne, instantly sensing his tense mood. But Alexander brushed it off, claiming a headache from overwork. She gave him a dubious glance, but seemed too tipsy to investigate further. A seed of doubt was firmly planted in Alexander's mind. The next morning, he tried to delicately question Adriana about her finances. She laughed it off, calling him paranoid. "Don't you trust me?" she asked, eyes shimmering with faux innocence. He admitted that maybe he had just been stressed with the new developments at Coleman Holdings. Yes, the firm was in dire straits. Hawthorne Capital had launched a near-hostile takeover of one of Alexander's largest affiliate funds. His attempts to rally new clients faltered. Rumors circulated that Alexander's personal life was a train wreck, which hardly inspired confidence among potential investors. On top of that, his best trader resigned after a heated argument about Alexander's lack of focus. He returned home dejected and anxious, but Adriana's sole concern seemed to be whether or not they'd still go to Paris in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Julia was nearing her due date. She moved in with her sister, Catherine, a no-nonsense accountant living in a quieter part of town. The shift in environment was a breath of fresh air. Although she felt the gaping hole left by Alexander's absence, she also felt supported by family who genuinely cared. With each passing day, Julia grew more determined. She was a teacher by trade, and resilience was woven into her DNA. Though her heart ached, she refused to let despair define her child's future. She attended prenatal classes, made new friends who were also expecting, and even arranged a small support group for single mothers at her local community center. Still, nights were the hardest. She'd find herself replaying memories, late-night talks with Alexander, the first time they moved into the penthouse, the moment they discovered she was pregnant. Tears would flow, and she'd hold her belly, whispering reassuring words to her unborn child. In these dark hours she found her own strength. "I have to be strong for both of us," she would murmur. As Alexander's sporadic visits dwindled, Julia realized she was better off on her own than tethered to someone who had so completely betrayed her. But a part of her still prayed for a miracle, that Alexander would awaken from whatever spell Adriana had cast and return to the woman who truly loved him. Alexander's professional life took a nosedive when an anticipated market rally never materialized. Coleman Holdings had placed heavy bets on tech stocks that suddenly tanked after a scandal rocked Silicon Valley. Millions were lost in a matter of days. Clients, once loyal, began pulling their investments en masse. Feeling the walls close in, Alexander leaned on Adriana for emotional support, only to find she was curiously absent. Late-night phone calls went unanswered, her whereabouts unexplained. When she finally did appear, she'd brush off his financial woes with an airy "money comes and goes," as though she had never worried about money a day in her life. But everything does come at a cost. As Coleman Holdings' losses made headlines, Adriana's so-called connections started distancing themselves. Expensive gifts and fancy trips no longer flowed as freely. Alexander found himself increasingly alone in that sophisticated loft, haunted by a sense of dread. He worried about his future, about the child he had all but abandoned, and about the woman he'd thrown away everything for, who was now proving to be far less committed than she had once seemed. The final straw came on a cool autumn morning. Alexander was rummaging through his emails when he found a series of urgent messages from his attorney, urging him to call back immediately. Hawthorne Capital had made a move that threatened to dismantle Coleman Holdings. Alexander needed to muster every resource, every ally to save his company. Desperate, he turned to Adriana, hoping that her wealthy circle might provide a last-minute loan, or at least a strategic partnership. She shrugged and said, "You know, I'm not really comfortable mixing my personal life with business." Her aloofness was shocking. Where was the woman who had once championed his every success? Where was the soulmate who had enticed him to abandon his wife? Stricken by panic, Alexander started to dig deeper into Adriana's life. He found that she'd never been listed as a student in any official Harvard University records. The philanthropic organizations she claimed to be affiliated with had no record of her volunteer work. One so-called friend admitted under discreet questioning that Adriana had once been rumored to work as an escort, targeting wealthy men in high society circles. Alexander's stomach churned with dread. If that rumor was true, what else had she lied about? He summoned the courage to confront her. At first, she feigned outrage, denying everything. But her anger soon morphed into cold amusement. "What did you think this was?" she sneered, no longer bothering with sweet talk. "You gave me what I wanted, and you walked out on your own wife. That's on you." He demanded answers about her multiple passports, the suspicious financial documents he'd seen. Adriana's lips curled into a mocking grin. "Let's just say I have a talent for reinvention. A girl has to do what she needs to survive in this world." She walked away with a casual wave, as if the entire conversation were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Suddenly, the humiliating truth was laid bare. He had been conned by a master manipulator, blinded by lust and fueled by arrogance. Devastated, Alexander wandered the streets of Manhattan. The once thrilling city lights now seemed harsh and unwelcoming. He couldn't bring himself to return to Adriana's loft, nor could he bear the shame of showing up at the penthouse he had shared with Julia. So he checked into a modest hotel under an alias, terrified that paparazzi or business rivals might discover him in this pitiful state. In that cheap, dimly lit room, he sat on the edge of an unremarkable bed and wept. Memories of Julia, radiant with pregnancy, came flooding back. He remembered the day they first visited that very Ritz-Carlton for a brunch buffet to celebrate a small win. She wore a simple sundress, and they talked excitedly about baby names, about the children they would have. Now, she was likely cradling a newborn he had never even bothered to hold. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine, Julia's sister. Julia gave birth to a baby boy. His name is Noah. I assume you don't care, but I thought you should know. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. For a moment, he stared, tears burning his eyes. He threw on his coat and rushed out of the hotel, not entirely sure where he was going. Alexander sprinted into the hospital, searching room by room for Julia. Nurses, used to frantic new fathers, guided him to the maternity ward. He found Catherine standing guard outside a private room, her arms folded. She glared at him with an expression that bordered on contempt. "You're too late," she said coldly. "They were discharged this morning." He pressed for more details. Catherine relented enough to reveal that both mother and baby were healthy, and Julia had gone back to her place with their parents, refusing to see or speak to him. Catherine's eyes flashed with anger and a hint of pity. "You broke her. I've never seen her so hurt." Now she's focusing on Noah. "If you truly care, you'll give her time." Alexander left the hospital feeling emptier than ever. The sense of loss was crushing. He had missed the birth of his own son. In that moment, he realized how much he had thrown away. For what? A glamorous mirage that had vanished the moment his fortune faltered. Crippled by guilt and desperation, Alexander tried to salvage what was left of his world. First, he met with his attorneys and senior partners at Coleman Holdings. The firm was on the brink of collapse. He sold some personal assets, his sports car, his shares in a luxury watch company, and used that liquidity to buy the firm enough time to restructure. It was a band-aid solution, but it kept them afloat for a few more critical months. Next, he tried reaching out to Julia. He wrote heartfelt letters, left long, apologetic voicemails, and sent flowers. Julia remained silent. Catherine relayed a simple message: focus on cleaning up your life. Only then might she consider hearing you out. Alexander took the words to heart. He severed ties with Adriana completely, though. To his surprise, she didn't protest. She had already moved on, apparently draining a new benefactor to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Alexander sought professional counseling to confront his actions. He spent many sessions dissecting why he had traded his stable marriage for a fleeting fantasy. The therapy was painful, forcing him to confront his arrogance, his insecurities, and the emotional void he had tried to fill with attention and glamour. In those sessions, he also unpacked his anguish over his lost family. The therapist encouraged him to be patient, to respect Julia's boundaries, and to dedicate himself wholeheartedly to personal growth. It was a humbling process, one that forced him to accept that redemption wouldn't come quickly if it came at all. A few weeks later, a strange twist arrived. Alexander discovered that Adriana had been arrested for suspected fraud and money laundering. The news broke late one evening, a short blurb on a local news website. Police had raided her loft, though, in typical Adriana fashion. It wasn't even leased under her real name. She'd been living a carefully orchestrated life of cons and scams, targeting wealthy men, forging identities, and laundering money through shell companies. Alexander felt a mix of relief and rage. The woman who had enticed him to betray his pregnant wife was now facing charges for crimes that could land her in prison for years. Everything about her had been a lie, from her Harvard education to her philanthropic pursuits. Part of him wanted to see her rot behind bars for the pain she had caused. Another part recognized that he had willingly stepped into her trap. If he hadn't been so easily swayed, so eager to indulge his own selfish desires, Adriana's charm would have held no power. Ultimately, he chose not to press any personal charges. The authorities had more than enough evidence without him. He had to focus on mending his own life, not on exacting vengeance. As the weeks passed, Alexander continued therapy, distanced himself from toxic influences in the social scene, and worked tirelessly to stabilize Coleman Holdings. Slowly, the firm rebounded, thanks to a combination of sound decisions and what Alexander could only describe as sheer luck. Some of the clients who had initially defected returned, sympathizing with his personal upheavals and hoping for a fresh start. He implemented new transparency policies and took on philanthropic initiatives that didn't just serve as photo ops but actually benefited underserved communities. All the while, he sent Julia weekly letters, updating her on his progress. He included gentle notes for Noah, though he had no idea if Julia even read them to him. Each letter ended with the same line, "I will always love you both, no matter where you are." One day, Catherine reached out. Julia needed a set of documents related to the baby's health insurance, and it required Alexander's signature. This was his first opening. He made an appointment to meet Catherine at a coffee shop. After signing the necessary forms, he couldn't resist asking, "How are they?" Catherine eyed him warily but responded, "They're doing fine. Noah's healthy. Julia is getting stronger every day." He hesitated before speaking again, voice trembling with sincerity. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to know if there's any chance I could see my son." Catherine sighed, a mixture of exasperation and empathy on her face. "I'll talk to Julia, but don't push. She has every right to keep her distance." Days stretched into weeks. Finally, Alexander received a message from Catherine. "Julia is willing to meet, but on her terms. Be respectful." His heart pounded as he made his way to a small park near Julia's parents' house. He chose a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree and waited. Julia arrived with Noah in a stroller. She looked thinner, more fragile, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. Noah was napping, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Alexander stood, unsure whether to approach. Julia motioned for him to sit down. She spoke softly, her voice laced with both pain and composure. "I agreed to this because I want Noah to know his father. But understand that I don't trust you, and I don't owe you anything." Alexander nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. I'm so sorry. I've changed. I'm trying to be better. I'll do whatever it takes to be part of his life." They spoke for nearly an hour. Julia's tone was guarded. She recounted the harsh reality of giving birth alone, the anger and hurt that still simmered within her. Alexander asked if he could hold Noah. With trembling hands, he carefully lifted the baby, feeling the warmth of his son's tiny body against his chest. He was overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Tears trickled down his cheeks. Julia watched him, unblinking. Part of her seemed moved by the raw emotion he displayed, but the walls around her heart were still firmly up. In the end, she consented to supervised visits on a strict schedule. Alexander left the park that day, feeling an odd mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He had glimpsed what might be possible, but he also realized the profound consequences of his betrayal would linger indefinitely. Just when Alexander thought he was finally moving forward, karma struck a devastating blow. A government investigation into Adriana's criminal network revealed that Coleman Holdings had unwittingly processed some of Adriana's illicit funds, an inevitable result of her entanglement with Alexander. Regulators froze certain company accounts, pending a thorough audit. Overnight, the progress Alexander had painstakingly achieved evaporated. The scandal rocked the financial press. Headlines read, "Coleman Holdings under scrutiny and Alexander Coleman's ties to alleged fraudster Spark probe." Clients panicked, pulling even more assets, fearful that the investigation could lead to heavy fines or criminal charges. Alexander hired the best lawyers he could afford, insisting that he had no knowledge of Adriana's illegal dealings. The legal process, however, was grueling. He endured countless depositions, combing through thousands of documents to prove that Coleman Holdings had been an unintentional conduit, not an accomplice. Financially, this was a catastrophe. He had to sell the penthouse, surrender many of his remaining luxuries, and even consider filing for personal bankruptcy. Emotionally, the toll was crushing. It was the ultimate cosmic justice. In betraying Julia for a woman who turned out to be a criminal, he had jeopardized not just his marriage, but also his entire livelihood. In one of life's bitter ironies, the only person who remained steadfast and offered emotional support was Julia. She heard about the legal troubles from mutual acquaintances. Though she was still deeply hurt by Alexander's actions, she couldn't help feeling some compassion. After all, they had once shared dreams and planned a family together. While she couldn't fix his predicament, she offered him a sympathetic ear, albeit with clear emotional boundaries. "Are you okay?" she asked in a soft phone call one evening. "Catherine told me you might lose everything." Alexander's throat tightened. I deserve it," he managed, fighting back tears. "I hurt you so much." Julia paused before responding gently, "You did. But that doesn't mean I want you destroyed. You're still Noah's father." Her words opened a path for more candid conversations. Over time, Julia allowed him to see Noah more frequently, albeit always in her or her family's presence. Alexander, humbled to the core, cherished every moment he had with his son playing peekaboo, feeding him mashed carrots, even singing lullabies that he once considered silly. These seemingly small gestures became the anchor that kept him from succumbing to despair. Months passed in a whirl of legal proceedings. Eventually, the auditors concluded that while Coleman Holdings had indeed processed tainted money, Alexander had not personally orchestrated or knowingly participated in the scheme. The firm was fined heavily, but no criminal charges were filed against him. Freed from the threat of jail time, Alexander faced the mammoth task of rebuilding the remnants of his career. He liquidated most of his assets to pay off the fine, leaving him far from the millionaire lifestyle he once flaunted. He moved into a modest apartment, took a substantial pay cut, and perhaps for the first time since his early 20s lived like an ordinary person. Oddly enough, he found some solace in this simpler existence, as it freed him from the incessant demands of social climbers, gold diggers, and false friends. The media eventually found another scandal to exploit, and Alexander slipped from the public eye. With the help of a few loyal clients and talented younger associates, he resurrected a scaled-down version of Coleman Holdings. The new company focused on ethical investments, community-based projects, and transparency, a stark contrast to the ambitious, risk-laden strategies of the past. One bright, cool morning, Alexander stopped by Julia's place to pick up Noah for a walk in the park. Their son was about a year old now, chubby-faced with bright blue eyes and an infectious giggle. As Alexander buckled Noah into his stroller, Julia emerged from the house, looking unusually nervous. "You should know," she said hesitantly, "I've been in therapy too. It's helped me realize that holding on to anger is like carrying a piece of hot coal. It only burns the person holding it." Alexander listened, heart pounding. Julia continued, "I'm not ready to say that I forgive you completely, but I see how you've changed, how you've fought to be a better person for Noah. That means something to me." He swallowed hard, emotions swirling. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That means everything." Julia offered a tiny nod. "Go have fun with Noah. We'll talk more later." For the first time since the affair exploded, Alexander felt a fragile sliver of hope that perhaps he might one day regain Julia's trust. It was faint but present, a delicate flame that he vowed to protect. Over the next few months, Alexander became the father he should have been all along, attending Noah's pediatric appointments, reading him bedtime stories, taking him to the playground. Each moment felt like a precious gift, a chance to glimpse a life that could have been. At times, he found himself mourning the lost opportunities to be there from the very start. But he also recognized that regrets wouldn't serve him unless they propelled him to be better. Professionally, Alexander embraced a quieter trajectory. He no longer cared about making headlines or being labeled a financial prodigy. He preferred small wins, steady growth, and forging genuine partnerships with clients who valued ethics as much as returns. Julia watched from a cautious distance, observing his transformation. They occasionally shared brief conversations, mostly about Noah's milestones. Once or twice, they ventured into personal territory. Julia would ask how he was coping, and he'd mention a new volunteer project or a neighborhood cleanup event he organized. She seemed guardedly impressed. Alexander never pushed for more than she was comfortable giving. He understood that the trust he'd shattered would take years to rebuild, if ever. Still, every small sign of warmth from her felt like a step toward redemption. Late one afternoon, Julia surprised Alexander by inviting him to dinner at her family's house. It was a casual affair, just her parents and sister, celebrating Noah's second birthday. Unsure of himself, Alexander arrived bearing a handmade scrapbook of photos he had taken over the past year. He had painstakingly documented each visit, each smile, each new thing that Noah discovered. During the meal, the tension was palpable. Julia's father rarely made eye contact, clearly still harboring resentment for the way Alexander had treated his daughter. Her mother was polite but distant. Catherine, though civil, kept a close watch, ready to intervene if Alexander overstepped. After the cake and presents, they gathered in the living room. Julia opened the scrapbook. Page by page, she saw evidence of Alexander's unwavering commitment to Noah. Candid shots of them at the park, at the zoo, building sandcastles on a beach. In each picture, Alexander's face radiated genuine love. Julia's eyes grew misty. She closed the book and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, voice catching, "for being there for him. Alexander inhaled deeply. He's given me so much joy. I'm just trying to be the dad he deserves. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was something, an ember of mutual respect, kindled by their shared love for Noah. Just when life seemed to be settling into a calmer rhythm, Alexander was blindsided by another visitor from his past. A private investigator, hired by one of Adriana's victims, approached him. The man explained that Adriana's network had extended beyond mere financial scams. There was an entire criminal ring that targeted corporate executives. A fresh wave of indictments was rolling out, and they needed Alexander's testimony to help lock up some of her associates. The old panic threatened to engulf him. He thought he had severed every tie to that disastrous chapter of his life. But the investigator insisted that Alexander's inside knowledge of Adriana's methods, however limited, could prove invaluable in court. If he refused, the criminals might walk free to scam more unsuspecting people. Conflicted, Alexander reached out to Julia for support. Though they were far from a reconciled couple, she listened. In a moment of unexpected compassion, she offered, "You should do it. You can't keep running from the consequences. This might be part of your path to truly making amends." Her words resonated. Alexander agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing every piece of information he had, however painful. It was to dredge it all up again. He attended depositions, identified suspicious bank records, and recounted personal anecdotes about Adriana's manipulations. The experience was harrowing, but a sense of moral responsibility compelled him to see it through. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, culminating in a trial where Adriana's associates faced charges for fraud, embezzlement, and even more serious crimes. Alexander's testimony helped secure convictions. The ordeal left him drained but strangely lighter. By taking a stand, he felt he had confronted the darkest part of himself, his willingness to be seduced by wealth, ambition, and superficial glamour. Word of his cooperation reached various corners of the business community. Some viewed him as a traitor to the old boy's network, but others praised him for having the courage to help stop a criminal enterprise. The renewed scrutiny also forced him to reflect on every mistake that had led to this point. In that reflection, he found a measure of peace. He could never undo the harm he caused, but he could strive to ensure he never repeated it. Julia, witnessing these steps toward redemption, softened incrementally. She allowed Alexander more unsupervised time with Noah, invited him to a few more family gatherings, and eventually, hesitantly, began meeting him for coffee to discuss parenting strategies. They weren't romantic dates, far from it, but they were civil, even friendly at times. During these moments, Alexander glimpsed the warmth in her eyes that he once took for granted. When Noah turned 3, Julia threw a small party in her parents' backyard. Balloons, a clown, a homemade cake. Neighbors and a few close friends attended. Alexander was there too, nervously helping with decorations. The day was a swirl of children's laughter, playful banter, and mild chaos, a welcome contrast to the tension that had defined their gatherings in the past. As the sun set, Julia and Alexander found themselves alone at the picnic table, the guests having moved to the front lawn to watch the kids play with sparkler sticks. Alexander leaned back, watching Noah chase a friend, both giggling uncontrollably. His heart swelled with gratitude. Suddenly, Julia spoke, her voice low. "I want you to know, I don't hate you anymore. I won't pretend I've forgotten everything that happened, but I see how hard you're trying. I see the father you've become." He turned to her, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't deserve kindness from you, but thank you. It means more than I can say." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the warmth of the setting sun wash over them. It was a small but significant step, hinting that perhaps, over time, forgiveness could blossom into something more. In the months following Noah's third birthday, Alexander and Julia began to rebuild a cautious friendship. They exchanged daily texts about Noah's schedule, funny moments, or small updates in their lives. Sometimes they'd meet for lunch, discovering they could talk without the tension of old wounds overshadowing every word. Alexander tread carefully, never pushing Julia for more than she was willing to offer. He respected her autonomy, aware that trust was a fragile thread, easily broken. Meanwhile, he continued therapy, focusing on personal growth and accountability. He helped lead charity drives, championing causes related to education and homage to Julia's love for teaching. Quietly, he hoped these actions would show her that he could be the partner she once believed he could be. Julia, for her part, was learning to let go of resentment. The more she saw Alexander in fatherly mode, patiently reading bedtime stories, wiping away Noah's tears, celebrating his smallest achievements, the more she realized that the man she fell in love with might still exist beneath the layers of past deceit. It was not an easy realization, and she fought waves of conflicting emotions. Could she risk letting him into her heart again? Just when it seemed like peace was within reach, Adriana's spectre reappeared, if only momentarily. She managed to contact Alexander from prison, sending a single letter scrawled in neat cursive. In it, she claimed remorse for her actions, insisting that their affair had been more than just a con, though she conceded she had manipulated him. She even hinted at wanting to see him, to right some wrongs. Alexander sat on this letter for days, torn. He felt no desire to meet Adriana. She represented a world of greed and lies, a world he was desperate to leave behind. Yet he also wondered if hearing her out might bring closure. Ultimately, he decided to visit her in prison, partly for his own peace of mind. When he arrived, Adriana looked thinner, her beauty diminished by the sterile surroundings and orange jumpsuit. She offered a half-hearted smile. "I know I hurt you," she began, "but I did care for you in my own way." Alexander felt a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, sorrow. "I came here because I needed to see for myself that this chapter is over," he said evenly. "I'm sorry for whatever led you down this path, but I'm done letting you control any part of my life." Adriana's eyes flickered with something like regret, but she stayed silent. He rose, turned away, and walked out, leaving her behind the plexiglass. The weight of that final confrontation lifted from his shoulders as he stepped into the crisp air outside, resolved never to look back. After that prison visit, Alexander felt an unburdening he hadn't experienced in years. He poured himself wholeheartedly into being the best father he could be. He embraced a quieter life, dropping off and picking Noah up from preschool, cooking simple meals at home instead of dining at Michelin-starred restaurants. His ambitions now revolved around fatherhood and building a stable future. Julia observed these changes, slowly letting her guard down. They began going on family outings, visits to the zoo, picnics in the park, and even day trips to the beach. Each experience felt like reclaiming a piece of happiness they had once known. On a crisp autumn day, after a particularly joyful outing with Noah, Julia invited Alexander back to her apartment for coffee. While Noah napped in his bedroom, they found themselves talking about the future, about Noah's education, potential family traditions, and ways they could cooperate as parents. Silence fell, a delicate pause full of unspoken tension. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, Julia said, "I still love you, in spite of everything. It's going to take time for me to trust you fully, but I want to try." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and Alexander gently reached out, brushing them away with his thumb. "I love you too," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I'll never stop trying to be worthy of you." They held each other, a cautious embrace that symbolized both a goodbye to the past and a tentative hello to a new future. Reconciliation was neither swift nor simple. They sought couples counseling, working through unresolved issues of betrayal, anger, and fear. Alexander shared the depths of shame he had felt, the guilt that haunted him, and the lessons he had learned. Julia expressed the profound hurt of being abandoned at her most vulnerable, the postpartum despair and anger that followed, and the weariness that still lingered. Over the course of a year, they rebuilt their bond, one therapy session, one tender conversation, one earnest apology at a time. Gradually, they found themselves laughing more often, recalling inside jokes from their college days. They discovered new aspects of each other, shaped by hardships but softened by humility and a renewed commitment to honesty. By Noah's 4th birthday, Alexander and Julia had moved in together, this time in a cozy townhouse near a good school district, close to both sets of grandparents. They decided to hold a housewarming and Noah's birthday party on the same day, inviting friends and family to celebrate not just a child's milestone, but also a new chapter for their own relationship. Standing on the porch, watching Noah chase bubbles in the yard, Alexander pulled Julia close. "Thank you for giving me another chance," he murmured. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for proving you deserved it." Their journey had been marred by betrayal, heartbreak, and a brush with criminal intrigue, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Sometimes the greatest redemption stories begin in the darkest hours. For Alexander and Julia, that darkness had led them back into each other's arms, guided by the unwavering light of a love that refused to be extinguished. And there you have it, a story of love, shattered by deceit and redeemed by humility. Alexander Coleman learned the hard way that no amount of wealth can buy back lost time or mend a betrayed heart overnight. By falling under the spell of a mistress who wasn't at all what she claimed to be, he nearly lost everything: his career, his family, and the respect of those who mattered most. In the end, what saved him was the courage to confront his own failings and the grace of a woman who found the strength to extend forgiveness, step by cautious step. If this gripping tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring more stories of life's twists and turns into the spotlight. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.